The British royal family today is just one generation of a monarchy that spans over 1,000 years. This series will focus on the lives of the monarchs who ruled England, starting with the Anglo-Saxon monarchs who ruled England until 1066. Alfred the Great was a king of Wessex from 871 to 899. He prevented England from falling to the Danes and promoted literacy. When he was born in 849, it seemed unlikely that Alfred would ever be king, since he had 4 older brothers and did not have a strong desire to rule. He had more of an interest in scholarly pursuits. He yearned for Latin learning and visited Rome in 853 and 855. Alfred didn't have much of an opportunity to acquire the education he desired until much later in his life. Alfred received an education in military arts and started active service in 868, when he and his brother King Æthelred I went to help Eadred of Mercia against a great Danish army. The Danes refused to battle and peace was made. That same year, Alfred married Eadwig, a woman descended from Mercian kings. The wedding ceremony took place in the royal villa of Sutton-Courtenay. The festivities lasted long into the night. During the festivities, however, Alfred fell ill with some kind of intestinal discomfort. This would last the rest of his life. Eadwig and Alfred had 5 children together who survived infancy, and they may have had more children who died in infancy but were never recorded. Their oldest surviving child was a daughter named Æthelfled. She married Æthelred of Mercia and was a formidable warrior who fought the Vikings. She was known as the Lady of the Mercians. Another daughter was named Æthelgefu and was the abbess of Shaftesbury. Their next child was a son named Edward, and he would succeed his father as Edward the Elder or King Edward I. Their next child, Æthelred, married Count Baldwin of Flanders and was an ancestress of Matilda of Flanders, who married William the Conqueror. Their youngest child was a son named Æthelwerd. Like his father Alfred, Æthelwerd showed a strong interest in learning and was educated in his father's school at court. In 871, the Danes invaded Wessex, and Æthelred and Alfred fought many battles against them. Æthelred died in 871 and Alfred succeeded him as king. After an unsuccessful battle at Wilton, Alfred made peace with the Danes. The Danes would not attack again until 876. The Danes invaded Wessex again, retired in 877 and re-attacked in 878. They established themselves at Chippenham, and the West Saxons submitted except King Alfred. He harassed the Danes from a fort in Somerset and gathered an army. They defeated the Danes at the Battle of Edington. They surrendered, and their king Guthrum was baptized, with Alfred as his sponsor. The Danes then settled in East Anglia. There was a period of peace in Wessex until 885, when Alfred repelled an invasion of Kent by a Danish army supported by the East Anglian Danes. In 886, he took the offensive and captured London, a success that brought all the English not under Danish rule to accept Alfred as king. Alfred met another serious attack by a large Danish force from Europe in 892, and it was not until 896 that the fighting stopped. Throughout the war, Alfred had old forts strengthened and new ones built at strategic sites. Arrangements were made for continual manning and maintenance of these sites. Alfred reorganized his army and used ships against invaders from 875. He had larger ships built for use against raids. Alfred's friendly relations with Mercia and Wales also helped Alfred's defences. Welsh rulers supported him and supplied troops for his army in 893. Alfred was successful in governance as well. He was good at organising finances and scrutinised the administration of justice. He protected the weak from oppression by corrupt judges. He made an important code of laws after studying the principles of law in the Bible and the codes of Kent, Wessex and Mercia. He limited the practice of blood feud and imposed heavy penalties for breach of oath or pledge. Alfred shared the view that only through learning could men acquire wisdom and live in accordance with God's will. During the lull from attacks between 878 and 885, Alfred invited scholars from throughout Europe to his courts to educate people. Being fluent in Latin, Alfred translated many books into English. He directed all young men to learn English. Alfred's reign also saw new buildings built and art created. Foreign craftsmen were attracted to his court. Alfred had little success in reviving the monastic life. He founded a monastery and nunnery, but there was little enthusiasm from the English for monastic life until the revivals of the European continent in the 10th century. Alfred passed away on the 26th of October 899. His wife Eadwig passed away 3 years later on the 5th of December 902. She was buried in the old minster next to Alfred. Their son Eadred finished his father's project of building the new minster at Winchester and had his parents' relics transferred there when it was completed. Alfred's memory lived on through the Middle Ages and in legend as a king who won victory even in the most hopeless of circumstances. Edward the Elder was an Anglo-Saxon king of Wessex. He ruled from 899 to 924 and extended the authority of Wessex over almost all of England by conquering areas previously held by the Danes. Edward the Elder was born around the year 874. His parents were Alfred the Great and Eadwig of Mercia. Edward had at least 3 sisters and 1 brother. As a child, Edward was educated at court by both male and female tutors, and received an education in both religious and secular studies. Even though Edward was the eldest son of the reigning king, his ascension was not assured, as he had cousins who had a strong claim to the throne. His cousins, Æthelheim and Æthelwold, were sons of Æthelred, Alfred the Great's older brother and predecessor. They were passed over because they were too young when their father died. An adult heir was preferable to a child heir. When Edward was 4 years old, he was sent to Rome, where a ceremony was conducted for Edward. Edward was given a sword, a belt, and the rank of consul. Alfred also stated in his will that Edward would receive most of the royal estate, and left his 2 nephews only a bit of land each. This meant if Æthelheim or Æthelwold was chosen as the next king, they would not have the income to support themselves as king. During Edward's childhood, there were numerous Viking invasions, and most of what would later become England came under the rule of Edward's father during this time. Edward married 3 times and had 14 children. His first marriage was to Ecgwin in 893. They had 2 children, Æthelstan and Edith. Their marriage ended around the year 900, and it is unclear if Ecgwin died or if their marriage was annulled. Edward's second marriage was to Æthelred, the daughter of Ealdorman Æthelheim, probably of Wiltshire. They had 8 children together: Ælfward, Edwin, Æthelhild, Eadgifu, Eadfled, Eadhild, Eadgaith, and Eadgiva. This marriage ended sometime before 919. Why the marriage ended is unclear, but it most likely ended due to the death of Ælfled, who may have died around this time. In 919, Edward married again, this time to Eadgifu, the daughter of Scyldhelm, Ealdorman of Kent. They had 4 children: Edmund I, Eadred, Eber, and Eadgifu. 3 of Edward the Elder's sons became king of the English. Edward the Elder became king of the Anglo-Saxons on the 26th of October 899, when his father died. His cousin Æthelwold disputed the succession and seized the royal estates of Wimborne and Christchurch. Edward led his army to Wimborne, and Æthelwold declared that he would live or die at Wimborne. But before fighting could start, Æthelwold fled to Northumbria, where the Danes accepted him as king. Edward the Elder was crowned on the 8th of June 900 at Kingston upon Thames. The following year, Æthelwold came with a fleet to Essex, and in 902 he persuaded the East Anglian Danes to invade English Mercia and northern Wessex. Edward retaliated by ravaging East Anglia. When he tried to retire, the men of Kent disobeyed the order to retire and were intercepted by the Danish army. The 2 sides met at the Battle of the Holm on the 13th of December 902. The Danish army won, but as Æthelwold died in battle, this ended the threat to Edward's throne. In 903, Edward issued several charters concerning Mercia, stating that Mercia was ruled by Æthelred and Æthelfled, Edward's sister, but Edward oversaw everything and effectively became the king of both Mercia and Wessex in all but name. As with most royal families, Edward arranged marriage alliances to foreign powers. In 919, Edward married his daughter Eadgifu to Charles the Simple, king of West Francia. And after Edward's death in 925, his daughter Eadgaith married Otto, future Holy Roman Emperor. In 906, Edward agreed to peace with East Anglian and Northumbrian Danes, which indicated that fighting must have occurred following the Battle of the Holm. In 909, Edward sent a combined West Saxon and Mercian army to harass the Northumbrian Danes. In 910, they retaliated by raiding Mercia, but were met by a combined Mercian and West Saxon army at the Battle of Tettenhall, where they suffered a disastrous defeat. The Northumbrian Danes did not venture south of the River Humber following this, and Edward and his allies were able to concentrate on conquering the southern Danelaw in East Anglia. In 911, Æthelred, Lord of the Mercians, died, and Edward took control of the Mercian lands around London and Oxford. His sister Æthelflaed ruled as Lady of the Mercians until her death. Edward and Æthelflaed began the construction of fortresses to guard against Viking attacks. In 912, Edward marched his army to Malden in Essex and ordered the building of forts at Witham and Hertford, which protected London from attack and encouraged the English living under Danish rule to submit to him. In 914, a Viking army sailed from Brittany and ravaged the Severn estuary. They attacked southeast Wales and captured Bishop Cephaloc. Edward ransomed him, and the Vikings were defeated by Edward's armies. They gave up their hostages. Armies were stationed in this area and twice had to repel attacks. Southeast Wales fell within the West Saxon sphere of power. More fortresses were built by Edward's forces. The Danes also built fortresses. In the summer of 917, the English killed the last Danish king of East Anglia. The Danes retaliated by sending a large army to lay siege to Malden, but were heavily defeated. By the end of the year, most of the Danish forces submitted to Edward, and the only Danish armies still holding out were those of Leicester, Stamford, Nottingham, and Lincoln. After Æthelflaed's death in 918, the Mercians submitted to Edward. In 901, Edward started building a religious community for men. The monastery he built was next to Winchester Cathedral, which became known as the Old Minster, while Edward's foundation was the New Minster. In 902, Edward's mother died, and he buried her and his father there. Edward's decision not to expand the Old Minster, but to overshadow it, suggests hostility between Edward and Bishop Denwulf. He also forced the Old Minster to cede land for the new site. He had the new minster built, as he did not think the old minster was grand enough to be a royal mausoleum. In Edward the Elder's later years as king, resentment grew in Mercia at the changes enacted by the king by organising Mercia into shires, ignoring the traditional boundaries and Mercian sensibilities. They also hated the imposition of rule by Wessex and the fiscal demands of the king. This provoked a Mercian and Welsh revolt at Chester. Edward's forces put down the revolt. Shortly after putting down the revolt on the 17th of July 924, Edward the Elder passed away and was buried in the New Minster in Winchester. Æthelstan is considered to be the first king of England. He was born in 894 AD as the eldest son of Edward the Elder and King Edward's first wife, Ecgwin. Not much is known about his mother. As a young child, Æthelstan's father remarried and had more children with his second wife. The marriage and subsequent sons, Ælfwerd and Edwin, born from this marriage, weakened Æthelstan's position as heir to his father's kingdoms. By 920, his father had taken a third wife, Eadgifu, and had two sons with her, Edmund and Eadred. Æthelstan was educated at the Mercian court of his aunt and uncle, Æthelflaed and Æthelred, and gained military experience in the Mercian campaigns. On the 17th of July 924, Æthelstan's father died. According to a charter from 901, Ælfwerd, Edward's eldest son by his second wife, ranked above Æthelstan in the line of succession. Mercia, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, acknowledged Æthelstan as king, while Wessex may have chosen Ælfwerd as their king. However, Ælfwerd died just 16 days after King Edward. After Ælfwerd's death, there was opposition to Æthelstan being king in Wessex. For a while, Æthelstan acted only as a Mercian king, issuing charters that were only witnessed by Mercian bishops. His coronation on the 4th of September 925 was held at Kingston upon Thames, bordering Wessex and Mercia, essentially claiming Wessex as his own. Opposition seems to have continued after his coronation. An unknown nobleman attempted to blind Æthelstan, which would have rendered him ineligible for kingship. In 926, Æthelstan arranged for his unnamed full sister to marry King Sitric. The kings promised not to invade each other's lands, but when Sitric died, Æthelstan invaded. Sitric's cousin Guthfrith led a fleet to take the throne, but Æthelstan prevailed, capturing York and receiving the submission of the people. He took Northumbria, and by 927 most of the kings of the north accepted Æthelstan's kingship. Æthelstan was the first English king to achieve control over northern Britain. Upon his father's death, Æthelstan had also inherited the authority over the Welsh kings. Effectively, Æthelstan was overlord of Britain. To get the nobles on his side, he lavished gifts upon them and purchased the territory of Amandrinus and gave it to the Archbishop of York. In 934, Æthelstan invaded Scotland. He was accompanied by 4 Welsh kings, 18 bishops and 13 earls. No battles were recorded during the campaign. By September, he was back in the south of England, where the Scottish king Constantine witnessed a charter acknowledging Æthelstan's overlordship. That same year, Olaf Guthfrithson succeeded Guthfrith as the king of Dublin and married Constantine's daughter. By 937, Olaf defeated his rivals and controlled most of Viking Ireland. Constantine and Olaf joined forces with the Strathclyde Britons and invaded England. They met at the Battle of Brunanburh. Æthelstan's forces won. Olaf escaped back to Ireland and Constantine lost a son. Æthelstan created a centralised government to rule his lands. Previously, charters were produced by priests, but from 928 until 935 they were produced by a scribe known as Æthelstan A. Following either his death or retirement, charters were produced by an individual rather than a writing office. Æthelstan formed the King's Council. As there was not a fixed capital city, Æthelstan stayed in Wessex and summoned leading figures from the surrounding lands to his councils. These councils helped to unify England. As king, Æthelstan enacted several laws. These included paying tithes to the church, the death penalty for stealing, and amnesty for thieves if they paid compensation. The church and state maintained a close relationship. Members of the church attended royal feasts and council meetings. Æthelstan donated generously to the church and founded a number of churches, including minsters at Milton Abbas and Mulchney. Æthelstan also sought to build ties with European churches. In 929, a priest named Cenwalh accompanied 2 of King Æthelstan's sisters to Saxony so that the future Holy Roman Emperor Otto could choose one as his wife. Cenwalh toured German monasteries, giving gifts on behalf of the king. England and Saxony became closer, and German names began to appear in English documents for the first time. During his reign, Æthelstan had a good relationship with European courts. This was mainly due to his sisters marrying foreign nobles. Æthelstan was unwilling to marry his female relatives to his own subjects, so his sisters had no choice but to either enter nunneries or marry foreign husbands. Æthelstan and many European powers had a common interest in resisting the threat of the Vikings and supported each other in the attempts to fight off the Vikings. Æthelstan died at Gloucester on the 27th of October 939. Despite his grandfather and father both being buried in Winchester, Æthelstan chose not to be buried there, as they had opposed his rule. He was buried at Malmesbury Abbey. He died unmarried and had no children. Edmund I was king of the English from the 27th of October 939 until his death on the 26th of May 946. He was born around the year 920. His parents were Edward the Elder and Eadwig, his father's third wife. Edmund's father died in 924 and his half-brother Æthelstan became king. He grew up at his brother's court, and his brother showed great kindness and affection towards Edmund and Edmund's younger brother, Eadred, who were only young when their father died. In 937, Edmund fought at the Battle of Brunanburh. 2 years later, Æthelstan died without children, so Edmund became the king. He was the first king to succeed to the throne of all England, and was crowned on the 1st December 939. Sometime before he became king, Edmund married his first wife, Ælfgifu, and had 2 sons with her, Eadwig and Edgar. She died in 944, and he remarried soon afterwards to Æthelred, with whom he had no children. Edmund's reign was not smooth sailing. Soon after Æthelstan's death, Anlaf Guthfrithson was accepted as King of York, and extended his rule to the 5 boroughs of Mercia. Edmund was forced to accept his rule, but recovered the lands and his position in 941 following Anlaf's death. In 942, he took back the 5 boroughs, and in 944 he regained full control over England and expelled the Viking kings of York. Like Æthelstan, Edmund had friendly relations with the many rulers of continental Europe, as many of them were married to his sisters. Edmund had similar interests to his brother and kept on many of the same advisors, although he did make changes to his personnel by moving away from relying on West Saxon men only to men with Mercian connections. Government was carried on by ealdormen. During his reign, his mother and brother both attested many of his charters, possibly indicating a higher level of cooperation and a united front from his family. Edmund had a keen interest in religion. He did not believe that Benedictine monasticism was the only worthwhile religion, like his son, and patronized both Benedictine and non-Benedictine establishments alike. On the 26th of May, 946, Edmund was stabbed to death at a royal hunting lodge in Puckelchurch while at a feast. As both of his sons were very young, his brother Eadred succeeded as king. Eventually, Edmund's son, Eadwig, would succeed as king in 955. After King Edmund was murdered, his younger brother Eadred succeeded as king and continued to defend the country from Viking invasions. He was chosen as king by the Wisshin above Edmund's own children, who were still children at the time. Eadred proved himself to be a worthy leader, though his life was ultimately cut short due to ill health. Born around 923, he was a son of Edward the Elder and Eadwig. His father died a year later, and his brother Æthelstan became king. During his time as king, Æthelstan conquered the northern Viking stronghold of York and passed the kingdom to his younger brothers. When Eadred became king, he had the responsibility of retaining these lands and fending off the Vikings. On the 16th of August 946, Eadred was crowned at Kingston upon Thames, and he kept his brother's advisors, as he trusted their judgment. As soon as he became king, Eadred received the submission of the northern earls as well as the Welsh rulers. Whilst this increased his power, he inherited a fragile power that could be easily toppled if he did not assert his control over all areas of his domain. Though Eadred received the submission of Northumbria, Wales and Scotland, this would remain temporary. Northumbria fell back into the hands of the Viking ruler and former king of Norway, Eric Bloodaxe. Eric had been invited by the Northumbrians as well as the Archbishop of York, who switched their allegiance to the Vikings. The king responded quickly and marched his army north, where they burned Ripon and ravaged Northumbria. Eadred made it clear he meant business, and they would face further threats of violence if they did not swear allegiance to him and end their support to Eric. They quickly renounced their support of Eric. Eadred captured the archbishop in 952 and had him imprisoned. While he was occupied with the archbishop, Olaf Sithrason established himself as the new king of Northumbria and Eric Bloodaxe as king of York. In an ambush by Eadred's followers, Eric was killed and Olaf fled back to Ireland. Eadred would retain his lands for the remainder of his reign. The king continued to defend his territory, inheritance and power, securing it for the next generation. During his reign, the monastic reform movement was still in its infancy. The king developed a close bond with Dunstan, the abbot of Glastonbury, and this support of Dunstan contributed to the revival. Dunstan was given more authority by the king and was allowed to issue charters on behalf of the king when Eadred's health began to fail. Eadred passed away on the 23rd of November 955, unmarried and without heirs. His throne passed to his nephew, Eadwig. On the 23rd of November 955, Eadwig became king, following the death of his uncle, King Eadred. Born in 940, he was the eldest son of King Edmund I. His parents were King Edmund and Ælfgifu of Shaftesbury. His father passed when he was very young, and his uncle took the throne, as Edmund's children were too young to rule. Eadred's reign lasted a decade, and he passed without heirs, so Eadwig inherited the throne in 955. Quickly, he developed a reputation for being more interested in women than ruling. At his coronation feast, he left it to entertain a woman. Dunstan, his advisor and his uncle's previous advisor, found him in the company of a woman and her daughter. These activities contributed to Eadwig's image as an irresponsible king and created a rift between Eadwig and his advisors. When Eadwig became king, he wanted to change the royal court to assert his independence and distance himself from his uncle's reign. To do this, he reduced the power of those around him, including his grandmother Eadgifu, ridding her of her own possessions. He hoped to gain more authority and control by doing this. Eadwig married the daughter Ælfgifu, whom he had been involved with, against the advice of his advisors, and the church disapproved of this union, citing that the two were cousins and within the degrees of consanguinity that marriage was forbidden. Ælfgifu's mother, Æthelgifu, did not want her daughter's prospects ruined and pressured Eadwig to oust Dunstan from court, which Eadwig did. Eadwig thus alienated the church and his own supporters, and this led to Mercia and Northumbria pledging their allegiance to Eadwig's younger brother, Edgar, whose reputation was much better than Eadwig's. In order to prevent war, Eadwig gave Edgar control of the north, which continued until Eadwig's death. In 958, Ælfgifu and Eadwig's marriage was annulled by the Archbishop of Canterbury. On the 1st of October 959, Eadwig died and his brother succeeded as king. King Edgar came to power in 959, uniting England after the disastrous reign of his brother Eadwig. He was born in 943, the second son of King Edmund and Ælfgifu of Shaftesbury. When Edgar was 3, his father died and his uncle Eadred succeeded as king, and was king until he died in 955. Eadwig then became king. His brother proved unpopular, and Edgar soon garnered much support from the nobility, and to prevent war, Edgar was given the north to rule over. Eadwig passed away in October 959, leaving the kingdom to Edgar, who proved himself to be a good king. He united the two halves of England and ruled peacefully until his death in 975. Thus he became known as Edgar the Peaceful. Edgar sought to reverse his brother's policies and relationships with the church. He recalled Dunstan from his exile, which Eadwig had imposed, and made him the Bishop of Worcester, and later of London, and then the Archbishop of Canterbury. The years of stability allowed Edgar to develop the laws of the land, which the Danish kings of England would later use, demonstrating how Edgar's rule became a blueprint for kingship in later generations. Edgar introduced further changes to infrastructure and administration in his kingdom, dividing England into shires, adopting a neutral policy towards the Danelaw, encouraging trade, and boosting the naval power of England. Edgar restored the relationship of the king and the church, which his brother had soured. His reign under the guidance of Dunstan was characterised by the monastic reform movement. This introduced the Benedictine rule to English communities. Edgar married 3 times. His first marriage was to Æthelred the Unready, who was the daughter of Ealdorman Odomer. They had one son, Edward. His second marriage to Wulfrith of Wilton produced one daughter, Edith. His final marriage was to Alfred of Devon. Alfred's first husband, Æthelwold, was killed in a hunting accident, which became the subject of much speculation, as it was thought that Edgar himself killed Æthelwold as he wanted to marry Alfred. Edgar and Alfred had 2 sons together, Edmund and Æthelred. In 973, King Edgar and Alfred attended his second coronation in Bath, orchestrated by Dunstan, the events of which paved the way for how English coronations would later be performed. Peace ended with Edgar's death in 975. His eldest son Edward succeeded as king. Edward the Martyr was king of the English from 975 until his death in 978. He was born in 962, the eldest son of King Edgar. Edward's mother remains unknown. She was either Æthelflaed or Wulfrith, the first and second wives of Edgar respectively. He had 3 siblings, Edith, Edmund and Æthelred. When Edward was 13, his father died. The succession was not clear, as Edgar did not name Edward as his heir. Both Edward and Æthelred put forward claims to be king. Edward was chosen as king as the eldest and was crowned by his supporters. As he was still young, a number of people acted on Edward's behalf. Very few charters survive from Edward's reign, leaving much of his reign in obscurity. All of the surviving charters concern the heartland of Wessex. During his father's reign, dies for coins were only cut at Winchester. During Edward's reign, he permitted dies to be cut locally at York and at Lincoln. King Edward's reign was cut short on the 18th of March 978. While visiting Alfred, his stepmother, and Æthelred, his half-brother, at Corfe Castle, Edward was murdered. Some say he was murdered by Alfred's servants, others say nobles in Æthelred's service, but most people agree that it was Alfred who was behind the murder. Edward's body lay at Warham for a year before being disinterred. His body was taken to Shaftesbury Abbey and reburied in a lavish ceremony. In 1001, his relics were translated to a more prominent place within the Abbey Church at Shaftesbury. The ceremonies were led by the Bishop of Sherborne. Edward was seen as a saint and a martyr by this time, and today he is recognised as a saint in the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Anglican Communion. Æthelred the Unready was king of the English from 978 until 1013, and then again from 1014 until his death in 1016. He was born in 966 to King Edgar and Queen Ælfrith, Edgar's 3rd wife. Æthelred's father died suddenly in 975, leaving 2 young sons behind. The elder, Edward, was on the cusp of adulthood, whereas Æthelred was still too young. Edward was chosen as king, a council ruling in his stead until he reached adulthood. Edward reigned for only 3 years before he was murdered, either by nobles or servants of Ætheldred's household. Many believed that Ætheldred's mother had plotted against her stepson, and while no one was punished for a part in the crime, and Ætheldred was crowned a month after the murder, his reign began in an atmosphere of suspicion which destroyed the prestige of the crown. Nevertheless, Ætheldred's coronation took place with much rejoicing. Due to his age, his mother ruled as his regent with a group of councillors until 984, when Æthelred had reached adulthood. Æthelred abandoned most of his councillors and launched on policies which involved encroachment on church privileges. Æthelred married 2 times. His first marriage to Ælfgifu in 985 resulted in the births of 10 children: Æthelstan, Ecgbert, Edmund Ironside, Eadred, Eadwig, Edgar, Edith, Ælfgifu, Wulfhild, and a daughter became the abbess of Weirwell Abbey. His second marriage to Emma of Normandy in 1002 resulted in the births of 3 children: Edward the Confessor, Alfred, and Godwinson. For a number of years, England had experienced peace from the Danish invaders, but beginning in 980, small companies of Danish adventurers carried out a series of raids along the coast. Danish attacks started growing in severity from the early 990s. Ætheldred's forces were comprised of infantry with a great number of mercenaries. He did not have substantial numbers of trained cavalry forces. During this period, the Normans offered shelter to the Danes returning from raids on England, which led to tensions between the English and Norman courts. Word of the tensions reached the Pope, and the Pope John XV, took steps to broker a peace between England and Normandy, which was ratified in 991 in Rouen. In August 991, a sizable Danish fleet began a campaign in the southeast of England. The battle that followed between the English and the Danes is recorded in the Old English poem, The Battle of Maldon, which describes the doomed but heroic attempt of the English to defend the coast of Essex against overwhelming odds. In the aftermath of Maldon, it was decided that the English would grant the tribute to the Danes. Yet this tribute did not stop the Danish campaigning in England, and in 994 they headed towards London. Æthelred met with the leaders of the Danish fleet and arranged an uneasy accord. A treaty was signed that provided for seemingly civilized arrangements between the then settled Danish companies and the English government. But the treaty also stipulated that the ravaging and murders of the previous year would be forgotten, and ended abruptly by stating that gold and silver would be paid to the raiders as a price for peace. In 994, Olaf Tryggvason, a Norwegian prince, was confirmed as Christian in a ceremony with King Æthelred as his sponsor. Olaf promised that he would never come back to England in hostility. Olaf then left England for Norway and never returned. In 997, Danish raids began again. Each time the Danes raided, Æthelred would pay for them to stop. But this did little to help. On the 13th of November 1002, Æthelred ordered the deaths of all Danish men in England to take place. Gunhilda, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, was said to have been among the victims. It is likely that Sweyn Forkbeard wanted to avenge his sister, and this was a primary motivation for Sweyn's invasion of Western England the following year. In 1004, Sweyn was in England and began his invasion. In this year, a nobleman of East Anglia met Sweyn in force and made an impression on the until then rampant Danish expedition. though the English were defeated at this battle, he caused the Danes heavy losses and was nearly able to destroy their ships. The Danish army left England for Denmark in 1005. For the next 3 years, England was free from attack. But this would not last. In 1008, the government created a new fleet of warships, but was weakened when one of the commanders became a pirate, and the king and his council decided not to risk it in a general action. The Danish army of 1009 was the most formidable force to invade England since Æthelred became king. It harried England until it was bought off in April 1012. Sweyn then launched an invasion in 1013, intending to crown himself King of England. By the end of that year, the English resistance had collapsed, and Sweyn had conquered the country, forcing Æthelred into exile in Normandy. But the situation changed suddenly when Sweyn died on the 3rd of February 1014. Sweyn's forces swore allegiance to his son, Cnut, but leading English noblemen restored Æthelred to the throne. Æthelred launched an expedition against Cnut. Æthelred first set out to recapture London, apparently with the help of Olaf Haraldsson. Olaf led a successful attack on London Bridge with a fleet of ships. He then went on to help Æthelred retake London and other parts of the country. Cnut and his army decided to withdraw from England in April 1014, leaving their English allies to suffer Æthelred's revenge. In 1016, Olaf left to concentrate his efforts on Western Europe, and Cnut returned to England. Æthelred's son, Edmund Ironside, revolted against his father and established himself in the north. Over the coming months, Cnut conquered most of England, and Edmund rejoined Æthelred in his efforts to fend off the Danes. On the 23rd of April 1016, King Æthelred died. Edmund and Cnut fought against each other, with Cnut defeating Edmund at the Battle of Æthelstan on the 18th of October 1016. The two men agreed to divide England, with Edmund taking Wessex and Cnut the rest of England. However, when Edmund died on the 30th of November, Cnut took over England as its king. Sweyn Forkbeard was King of Denmark from 986 until his death in 1014, King of England for 5 weeks from December 1013 until his death, and King of Norway from 999 until his death. He was born on the 17th of April 963. His parents were Harold Bluetooth and Tove of the Orbitrites. He married Sigrid the Haughty and had 8 children with her: Harold, Cnut, Eadred, Gaitha, Gunhilda, Santaslo, and Tura. In the mid-980s, Sweyn revolted against his father and seized the throne for himself. Harold was driven into exile and died shortly afterwards in November 986 or 987. Harold had already established a foothold in Norway, controlling Viken in 970. He lost control over his Norwegian claims following his defeat against a German army in 974. Sweyn built an alliance with the Swedish king Olaf Sweitkonen and Erik Hakanarsson against the Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason. One motivation behind this alliance was the fact that Olaf had slapped Sweyn's wife. The Allies attacked and defeated King Olaf in the western Baltic Sea when he was sailing home from an expedition. The victors divided Norway between them. Sweyn regained direct control of the Viken district. Erik and Sweyn proved strong, competent rulers, and their reign was prosperous. Many sources say they became Christians, but allowed their people religious freedom, which led to backlash against Christianity. In 1002, Sweyn decided to invade England after the St. Brice's Day massacre, where the Danes were killed under orders from Æthelred the Unready. Sweyn's sister was killed in the attack. Sweyn negotiated an agreement with Duke Richard II of Normandy, whereby the Danes gained permission to sell their spoils of war in Normandy. Sweyn campaigned in England from 1003 to 1004, but left in 1005 due to a famine. Further raids took place between 1006 and 1012. In 1013, Sweyn led his forces in a full-scale invasion of England. The English put up a good fight, but were overpowered by the Danes. King Æthelred fled to the Isle of Wight, and Sweyn took England for himself. He reigned as king until his death on the 3rd of February 1014, of which his cause of death is unknown. Edmund Ironside was born around 990. He was the third son born to King Æthelred of the English and his wife Ælfgifu of York. His brothers were Æthelstan, Egbert, Eadred, Eadwig and Edgar, and his sisters were Eadgyth, Ælfgifu Wulfhilda, and the abbess of Wyrwell Abbey. His mother died around 1000 and his father remarried, this time to Emma of Normandy, whom he had 2 sons with, Edward and Alfred, and a daughter named Goda. Edmund was close to his older brother Æthelstan, and they felt threatened by Emma's ambitions for her own sons. Edmund's childhood and early adulthood were marred by war. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard seized the English throne, and Æthelred fled to Normandy. His sons stayed in England, though. In February 1014, Sweyn died, and Cnut was accepted by many as king. However, Æthelred returned to England, and with the help of Edmund, launched an attack, forcing Cnut to flee. Æthelred was renamed King of the English. By June 1014, Æthelstan and Egbert were dead, so Edmund was Æthelred's heir. In 1015, Siegfried and Morcar came to Oxford to ask for a royal pardon, but were murdered instead. The king ordered that Siegfried's widow, Eadgyth, be seized and brought before him, but Edmund seized her and married her instead. Edmund and Eadgyth had 2 children, Edward and Edmund. Edmund received the submission of the English people. At this time, Cnut launched a new invasion of England. Edmund raised an army and revolted against his father, whom he saw as weak, and established himself in the north. Over the coming months, Cnut conquered most of England, and Edmund rejoined Æthelred in his efforts to fend off the Danes. On the 23rd of April, 1016, Æthelred died. Edmund and Cnut fought against each other, with Cnut defeating Edmund at the Battle of Æthelstan on the 18th of October 1016. The 2 men agreed to divide England, with Edmund taking Wessex and Cnut taking the rest of England. However, when Edmund died on the 30th of November that year, Cnut took over the rest of England as its king. Cnut sent Edmund's children to Sweden instead of killing them. King Olaf of Sweden sent them to Kiev, where his daughter was the Grand Princess. They eventually ended up in Hungary, where Edmund died, but Edward survived. Edward married a woman named Agatha. They had 3 children, Edgar, Margaret, and Christina. Edward returned to England in 1057, but died within a few days of arrival. His son Edgar was briefly proclaimed king after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, but submitted to William the Conqueror. Edward's daughter Margaret married King Malcolm III of Scotland. Cnut was King of England from 1016 until 1035, King of Denmark from 1019 to 1035, and King of Norway from 1028 to 1035. The place and date of his birth are unknown. Cnut was the grandson of Mieszko I, a Polish ruler, through his mother. In 1013 he accompanied his father Sweyn Forkbeard to England. Cnut was in charge of a fleet at Gainsborough, and it was there he met his first wife Ælfgifu. They had 2 sons together, Sweyn and Harold. By the end of 1013, Cnut's father was King of England, but he died only months later, and Æthelred, the previous king, returned. Cnut and his men planned to attack, but Cnut deserted his allies and returned to Denmark. In 1015, he returned and began a long struggle to take the English throne. In April 1016, King Æthelred died. The English Witan or Council elected Cnut King of the English. But the councillors that were in London elected Edmund, Æthelred's eldest surviving son, as king. Cnut and Edmund went to war, with Cnut winning. They decided to divide the kingdom, but when Edmund died only a month later in November, Cnut took over the entire country. His first acts as king were to give Englishmen's estates to his Danish followers, have King Edmund's brother Eadwig killed, and had several prominent Englishmen killed or exiled. He exiled Edmund's sons to Sweden. Eventually, Englishmen were holding earldoms in Wessex and Mercia, and the Danish element to his rule decreased. By 1018, the Danes and the English reached an agreement. A draft of the treaty survives to this day and was written by Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who later drew up Cnut's laws. To gain support, Cnut married King Æthelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, in 1017. Emma's sons were living in Normandy. To do this, he set aside his first wife, Ælfgifu. This was to prevent the Duke of Normandy, Emma's brother, from helping his nephews to take the English throne for themselves. Emma and Cnut had 2 children together, Harthacnut and Gunhilda. The English helped Cnut secure his position as King of Denmark after the death of Cnut's brother in 1019. They also helped when Cnut's regent in Denmark, Ulf Jarl, his brother-in-law, joined the King of Norway and the King of Sweden in a coalition against Denmark. Though Cnut was defeated in the battle that followed, the Battle of the Holy River, terms were made and Cnut egged on the Norwegian landowners against their king, Olaf II Haraldsson, to drive him out in 1028. Cnut put his ex-wife Ælfgifu and son Sweyn in charge of Norway. Cnut travelled to Scotland in 1027, where he received recognition from 3 of the Scottish kings. Cnut's control over the Baltic trade route benefited the English, who profited greatly. Cnut proved an effective ruler who brought peace and prosperity. He was a generous and supportive donor to the church. In 1027, Cnut went on a pilgrimage to Rome and attended the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. He secured reductions in tolls for English traders and pilgrims while there. Denmark also benefited from Cnut's friendship with the emperor, who surrendered Schleswig and the territory north of the Eider River in exchange for a marriage between the emperor's son Henry to Cnut's daughter Gunhilda. None of Cnut's successors inherited his qualities. His son Harold ruled England until 1040, and his son Harthacnut ruled Denmark from 1035 and England from 1040. Eventually, the English throne passed back to the old royal line in 1042, and Denmark passed to Sweyn II, son of Earl Ulf and Eadred. Harold Harefoot, or King Harold I, was King of England for a short period of time. Harold was a son of King Cnut and Ælfgifu of Northampton. In 1016, his father set aside Ælfgifu and married Emma of Normandy in a political marriage. This marriage resulted in another son being born, Harthacnut. With Harthacnut's birth, the succession became blurred, as it was now the destiny of Harthacnut to inherit his father's position. Harold was bypassed for succession despite being the oldest son. Emma of Normandy had been married to a previous English king, King Æthelred the Unready, and brought 2 more claimants to the English throne, sons Alfred and Edward. Harold bided his time. He became known by the nickname of Harefoot due to his speed and agility. In 1035, King Cnut died, and Harthacnut inherited his thrones. He became King of Denmark and was immediately faced with the threat of Magnus I of Norway. Harthacnut focused his efforts on Scandinavia, leaving England vulnerable. Harold took the opportunity and seized the English crown for himself. Cnut had willed that his possessions be divided evenly between his sons, but Harold took everything for himself. The Great Council in Oxford confirmed Harold as King of England in 1035, but he was not without opposition. The Archbishop of Canterbury refused to crown Harold, and instead offered to perform the ceremony without the sceptre and crown. In response, Harold denounced Christianity and refused to attend church until he was crowned king. In defence of her son Harthacnut, Emma of Normandy amassed a large support base and retained her power in Wessex. She acted as regent in Wessex, where she fought to access the power of the throne for her son. Her two sons from her marriage to Æthelred arrived back in England, having amassed a fleet in Normandy. However, they found little support, as many resented their father's reign. This situation proved ideal for Harold, as his stepmother remained alone, Harthacnut stuck in Denmark, and his stepbrothers without English support. In order to stabilise his grip on power, Harold ordered Earl Godwin to assassinate Alfred and Edward. He killed Alfred, and Edward narrowly escaped his fate and fled back to Normandy. In 1037, many of the English accepted Harold as king, despite the initial opposition from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Emma, now back on the continent, met with Harthacnut and planned to remove Harold from the throne. A few weeks before a planned raid on England, Harold died from illness on the 17th of March 1040. He was initially buried at Westminster Abbey. However, after Harthacnut arrived in England, he had Harold's body exhumed, beheaded, and thrown into the River Thames. Finally, Harold's body was pulled out of the water and laid to rest in a cemetery in London. Harthacnut was King of Denmark from 1035 to 1042, King of the English from 1040 to 1042, and was the last Danish King of England. Harthacnut was born around 1018 to Cnut the Great and Emma of Normandy. Harthacnut spent much of his childhood in Denmark, as had been arranged by his father. He was made Crown Prince of Denmark as a child, with Ulf Jarl, the husband of his aunt, as his regent. By the time Harthacnut was 10 years old, his father had already claimed Norway. In 1035, King Cnut died, and Harthacnut succeeded him as King of Denmark. He was supposed to succeed as King of England as well. However, he faced unrest in Denmark and Norway, as Magnus I had taken the Norwegian throne. So Harthacnut focused his attention on Denmark and Norway. Meanwhile, in England, Harold Harefoot, a son of Cnut by his first wife, took the English throne and was proclaimed king. Harthacnut's mother attempted to maintain power in Wessex for Harthacnut. In order to stabilise his grip on power, Harold ordered Earl Godwin to assassinate Alfred and Edward, the half-brothers of Harthacnut. Earl Godwin killed Alfred, and Edward narrowly escaped his fate and fled back to Normandy. Emma fled and met Harthacnut, who sailed to arrange a strategy with her. However, this was not necessary, as Harold died from illness in 1040. Harthacnut arrived in England with his mother in June 1040 with 60 warships in case he was met with resistance. As soon as he was proclaimed king, Harthacnut sought revenge for the murder of his half-brother Alfred. He had Harold's body disinterred and beheaded. The corpse was thrown into the River Thames before being retrieved and buried in a churchyard. Godwin was arrested and put on trial. However, he evaded punishment by offering a ship to Harthacnut. Harthacnut now focused on doubling the English fleet to deal with outside threats posed to England and Denmark. To fund this, he increased taxes, which led to resentment from the English. Harthacnut's way of ruling also made things worse. Usually the king ruled with a council of advisors. Harthacnut did away with the council and ruled on his own, making decisions as he saw fit. He intimidated those around him to enforce his rule. As you might expect, the people were not happy. Eventually they had enough, and in 1041 some tax collectors were murdered. Harthacnut's way of handling the situation proved unpopular. He ordered the town that had murdered the tax collectors burned down and all of its civilians killed. Many of the residents fled once word of the punishment reached them. Although the town was burnt and plundered, the civilian casualties were low. Though Harthacnut's reign was only 2 years, for the English it was 2 years too many. He died on the 8th of June 1042 from a suspected stroke. Edward the Confessor was the last king of the House of Wessex, reigning for 24 years from 1042 to 1066. He was born in Oxfordshire around the year 1003, the 7th son of King Æthelred the Unready. His mother was Emma of Normandy. His childhood was marred by war and conflict from Viking raids targeting England. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard seized the throne, forcing Emma to flee with her sons, Edward and Alfred. He spent much of his life in France. His father Æthelred died in 1016, and Edward's half-brother Edmund Ironside continued to fight against the Danes. Sweyn Forkbeard's son Cnut and Edmund divided the kingdom between themselves, but Edmund died by the end of 1016, and Cnut took the throne for himself. Cnut had Edward's half-brother Eadwig killed, leaving Edward the next in line to the throne. Cnut then married Edward's mother in 1017. Edward vowed he would return to England one day as its rightful king. Edward received the backing of the Duke of Normandy and the Church. The Church supported him due to his conviction and deep religious faith, which he would later become well known for. Despite this support, his chances of becoming king were slim, especially due to his mother favouring her son Harthacnut by Cnut. In 1035, Cnut died and Harthacnut put all his focus on Denmark, leaving the English throne vacant. Harold Harefoot, the older half-brother of Harthacnut, took this opportunity and took the English throne for himself. A year later, Edward and Alfred travelled to England. They were attacked by Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. Alfred was blinded with hot pokers and succumbed to his injuries. Edward held a seething hatred and grudge against Godwin. Edward returned to Normandy. In 1040, Harold died and Harthacnut took the throne. Harthacnut invited Edward to England. In 1042, Edward would become king upon his brother's death. His coronation took place at Winchester Cathedral on the 3rd of April 1043. He did not forget all that had happened to him. He felt that his mother had abandoned him in favour of his brother and deprived her of her property. Edward faced opposition in Scotland and Wales. He managed a forceful campaign and in 1053 ordered the assassination of the southern Welsh prince Rhys ap Rhydderch. Griffith ap Llewellyn emerged in 1055 and declared himself the ruler of Wales, but he was forced back by the English, who forced Llewellyn to swear an oath of loyalty to the king. Edward was heavily influenced by his Norman upbringing, which did contribute to a growing atmosphere of resentment against him. In 1042, he ordered the building of Westminster Abbey. In January 1045, to placate the English, Edward married Edith, a daughter of Godwin, Earl of Wessex. They had no children. Edward's position as king was compromised by the power held by the earls, especially Godwin, Leofric, and Siward. They grew resentful over the king's favouritism towards Normandy. Tensions boiled over when Edward chose Robert of Jumis as Archbishop of Canterbury, instead of Godwin's choice. The Archbishop accused Godwin of plotting to kill the king. Edward seized this opportunity to oust Godwin, and in 1051 he had Godwin and Godwin's family exiled. One of Godwin's sons, Wulfnoth, was arrested and kept imprisoned for the rest of his life. Edith was sent to a nunnery due to the falling out, and possibly due to their marriage not producing any heirs, and Edward hoping to divorce her. When the Godwins returned a year later, Edith was reinstated as queen. Later in his reign, Edward began distancing himself from the political scene, preferring to engage in pleasure and attending church. Soon the Godwin family were seen as the real power behind the throne. In 1053, Harold, Godwin's son, began to deal with rebellions in the north of England and Wales. Edward chose Harold as his successor, even though it had been established that William, Duke of Normandy, would assume the throne. This decision would lead to conflict later after Edward's death. In December 1065, King Edward fell into a coma, and on the 5th of January 1066 he died. Harold Godwinson was born in the early 1020s to Godwin, Earl of Wessex, and Gaitha, the sister of Earl Iolf, Cnut the Great's brother-in-law. He had 5 brothers, Sweyn, Tostig, Gurth, Leofwine and Wulfnoth, and 3 sisters, Edith, Gunhilda and Elfgifu. Harold's sister Edith married King Edward the Confessor. In 1051, Harold, his father and siblings fell out of favour with the king and fled the country. His brother Wulfnoth was arrested and imprisoned for the rest of his life. Edith was sent to a nunnery. In 1052 the family returned and fell back into favour with the king, who allowed Edith to return as well. Godwin passed away in 1053, and Harold inherited the earldom of Wessex, making him one of the most powerful men in England. He served as the king's lieutenant, fighting rebellion in Wales and dealing with a revolt against his brother Tostig in Northumbria. He exiled Tostig, which led to Tostig developing a deep hatred for Harold. Harold married twice. His first marriage was to Edith the Fair, or Edith Swanneck, a granddaughter of Æthelred the Unready through one of his daughters. Together they had 6 children: Godwin, Edmund, Magnus, Gunhilda, Gaitha and Ulf. Their marriage ended when Harold set her aside. Harold then married Edith of Mercia sometime around 1066, and they had 1 son together named Harold. In 1064, Harold apparently met William, Duke of Normandy, and swore an oath to support the Duke's claim to the English throne. On the 5th of January 1066, King Edward the Confessor died. He had named Harold Godwinson his heir, going back on his word to William, the Duke of Normandy. This led to a succession crisis. Harold was elected by the Witan of England as the new monarch the next day and had his coronation that very same day. However, his position was far from secure. Several people came forward with claims to the English throne. Harald Hardrada was King of Norway and claimed that an agreement made by the previous King of Norway, Magnus I, and Harthacnut, Edward the Confessor's half-brother, stated that if either of them died without an heir, the surviving king would become ruler of both kingdoms. Tostig, Harold's brother, also claimed the throne for himself and raised a fleet in Flanders to launch raids against England. Harold raised an army and navy himself and forced Tostig to retreat. Tostig went to Scotland and then Norway to garner support for his cause. In spring 1066, King Harold of Norway assembled his fleet to join forces with Tostig in Scotland. Their invasion plan was to start in September 1066. Around the same time, William of Normandy was planning his own invasion. He claimed Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne. He quickly assembled his fleet. Supposedly, he received support from the Pope, who provided him with the papal banner as a sign of approval. He planned to invade in September 1066 also. King Harald of Norway and Tostig launched their invasion. On the 20th of September 1066, they fought a battle of Fulford, winning the battle. Harold soon learned of the news of the battle and raced to assemble his forces. On the 25th of September 1066, the Battle of Stamford Bridge took place, with Harold succeeding. The Norwegian king and Tostig were among the casualties that day. The Vikings retreated and accepted the terms of a truce with King Harold, promising never to invade England again. Only 3 days later, William of Normandy arrived on the English shores, setting up base and fortifications at Hastings. On the 1st of October, Harold learnt of their arrival and assembled his troops. Harold was determined to end the threats to his reign. The Battle of Hastings, one of the most famous English battles, occurred on the 14th of October 1066. Harold took up a defensive position on a ridge, whilst William gave his orders to his archers to fire uphill. At first the Normans found it difficult to break the English line of defence. The tide turned in the favour of the Normans when some Bretons broke away and several of Harold's men broke off in pursuit. This led to the English forces being cut off and isolated. William feigned retreat in order to split apart the English troops further, and they fell into the trap. The English were then struck down by arrows, one of which struck Harold in the eye, killing him. After his death, the English continued fighting, but crumbled under the Norman pressure. Despite King Harold II's efforts, he was no match for the Normans. He was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England.